World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, raged from 1939 to 1945. It was a war that saw unprecedented levels of destruction and loss of life, affecting nearly every corner of the globe. The conflict began with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, which set off a chain reaction of alliances and hostilities that would engulf the world in a matter of months. It engulfed nations across the globe, leaving behind a trail of devastation and forever altering the course of history. Cities were reduced to rubble, and entire communities were wiped out. The sheer scale of the destruction was unimaginable, with millions of homes, schools and hospitals obliterated in the relentless bombings and battles. From the bustling cities of Europe to the remote islands of the Pacific, millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the crossfire of this devastating war. The front lines stretched across continents, with battles fought in deserts, jungles and frozen tundras. Soldiers faced not only the enemy, but also harsh weather conditions, disease and the constant threat of death. The world watched in horror as the horrors of war unfolded on a scale never before witnessed. Families were torn apart, and the psychological scars of the conflict would linger for generations. Newsreels and photographs brought the grim reality of the war into living rooms around the world, making it impossible to ignore the suffering and destruction. The war was a clash of ideologies, a battle between democracy and tyranny. Propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and rallying support for the war effort. Posters, films and speeches were used to demonize the enemy and bolster the resolve of the home front. The ideological battle was as fierce as the physical one, with each side convinced of the righteousness of their cause. On one side stood the Allied powers, led by Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. These nations, despite their differences, united in their determination to defeat the Axis powers. Leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin became symbols of hope and resilience, inspiring their people to endure the hardships of war. They fought to defend freedom, democracy and the rule of law against the aggression of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy and Japan. The Axis leaders, driven by ambitions of conquest and domination, unleashed a campaign of terror and brutality. Their actions led to some of the darkest chapters in human history, including the Holocaust and the atrocities committed in occupied territories. The world held its breath as the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Every battle, every strategic decision had the potential to change the course of the war. People anxiously followed the news, hoping for signs of victory and fearing the worst. The uncertainty and tension were palpable, as the outcome of the war would determine the future of nations and the lives of millions. The outcome of this epic struggle would shape the world for generations to come, determining the political, economic and social order for decades. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era, with the establishment of the United Nations and efforts to rebuild and reconcile. The lessons learned from the conflict would influence international relations and policies, striving to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The seeds of World War II were sown in the aftermath of World War I. The devastation left behind by the Great War was unprecedented, leaving nations grappling with immense loss and destruction. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war, but left Germany deeply resentful. The treaty was intended to ensure peace, but instead it planted the seeds of future conflict. The treaty imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including territorial losses, disarmament and crippling reparations payments. These measures were meant to weaken Germany, but they also fostered a sense of injustice and betrayal among the German people. These punitive measures crippled the German economy and fueled a deep sense of humiliation and anger among the German population. Hyperinflation, unemployment and poverty became rampant, leading to widespread discontent and unrest. The war also shattered the existing world order, leaving a void that new ideologies and power structures rushed to fill. The political landscape of Europe was forever altered, with old empires crumbling and new nations emerging. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, once major powers, collapsed, creating political instability in Europe and the Middle East. The power vacuum left by their demise led to a period of turmoil and uncertainty. The rise of communism in Russia, following the Bolshevik Revolution, further added to the global unrest. The spread of communist ideology threatened the existing social and political order, leading to fear and suspicion among other nations. The League of Nations, established in 1920 to prevent future wars, proved ineffective in addressing the underlying tensions and grievances that festered in the post-war world. Despite its noble intentions, the League lacked the authority and power to enforce its decisions. Its inability to enforce collective security and its failure to address the concerns of its member states undermined its credibility and paved the way for future conflict. The League's shortcomings became evident as tensions continued to rise in the 1930s, ultimately leading to the outbreak of World War II. The economic hardship and social unrest that plagued Europe in the aftermath of World War I created fertile ground for extremist movements. Desperate for solutions, many people turned to radical ideologies that promised change and stability. In Italy, the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini marked the beginning of a new era of authoritarian rule. Similarly, in Germany, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, began to gain traction, capitalizing on the widespread discontent and economic woes. The impact of the post-war treaties was not limited to Europe. Across the globe, colonial subjects who had fought in the war began to demand greater autonomy and independence. The seeds of decolonization were sown, leading to a wave of independence movements in the decades to come. The war also brought significant social changes. Women who had entered the workforce in large numbers during the war began to demand greater rights and opportunities. The 1920s saw a cultural shift, with new ideas and values challenging traditional norms. Technological advancements made during the war had a lasting impact on civilian life. Innovations in communication, transportation, and medicine transformed societies, while the horrors of modern warfare left a lasting impression on the collective consciousness. As the world reflected on the devastation of World War I, there was a collective hope that such a conflict would never happen again. The lessons learned from the war shaped international relations and efforts to build a more peaceful world, even as new challenges emerged. Memorials and remembrance ceremonies were established to honor those who had lost their lives. The legacy of World War I continues to be felt today, reminding us of the importance of striving for peace and understanding in a complex and ever-changing world. In the political and economic turmoil that followed World War I, new ideologies emerged, promising stability and a return to former glory. Fascism, with its emphasis on nationalism, militarism and authoritarianism, gained traction in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini's rise to power in 1922 marked the beginning of a dangerous trend in Europe. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party exploited the economic hardship and political instability of the Weimar Republic. Hitler's toxic ideology, a dangerous mix of nationalism, anti-Semitism and territorial expansionism, resonated with a population desperate for a solution to Germany's woes. The Nazis promised to restore German pride and power, preying on the fears and frustrations of the masses. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 marked a turning point in European history. His totalitarian regime systematically dismantled democratic institutions, suppressed dissent, and embarked on a campaign of racial persecution and genocide. The world watched with growing alarm as Germany rearmed, violating the Treaty of Versailles and signaling its aggressive intentions. As Hitler's Germany grew more belligerent, the world watched with a mix of fear and uncertainty. The rise of the Nazi regime was not just a political shift, it was a harbinger of a new and terrifying era. The democratic powers of Europe, haunted by the horrors of World War I, adopted a policy of appeasement. The memories of the trenches, the gas attacks, and the staggering loss of life were still fresh in the minds of many. They were desperate to avoid another catastrophic conflict. Eager to avoid another devastating war, they sought to accommodate Hitler's demands in the hope of satiating his appetite for conquest. Leaders like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that by giving in to some of Hitler's territorial claims, they could maintain peace in Europe. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which ceded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Germany, stands as a prime example of this flawed policy. Chamberlain famously declared that the agreement had secured peace for our time, but this peace was illusory. However, appeasement only emboldened Hitler, convincing him of the weakness and resolve of the Western powers. He saw their concessions not as acts of diplomacy, but as signs of their unwillingness to confront him militarily. He interpreted their concessions as a sign of weakness and became even more determined to pursue his expansionist ambitions. His speeches grew more aggressive, and his plans for territorial expansion became bolder. With each act of aggression that went unchecked, Hitler's confidence grew, and the world edged closer to the brink of war. The annexation of Austria, the occupation of the Rhineland, and the demands on Poland were all steps in his grand plan for a greater Germany. The failure of appeasement became tragically clear in March 1939, when Germany, in violation of the Munich Agreement, invaded and occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. The world watched in horror as the fragile peace crumbled. The world finally realized that Hitler's ambitions could not be appeased, and that war was imminent. The leaders of Britain and France, who had once believed in the possibility of peace through negotiation, now faced the grim reality of preparing for war. The stage was set for a global conflict that would test the limits of human endurance. Nations began to mobilize, alliances were formed, and the world braced itself for the most devastating war in human history. The lessons of appeasement were harsh, but they underscored the necessity of standing firm against tyranny and aggression.